Skeletons in the closet. Okay, prologue. Saturday, January 18th, 1947. The Oldsmobile barreled headlong through the night, its headlights casting the only light Daryl Morton had seen for hours along Route 40. As the narrow, curved roadway straightened before him, Daryl glanced toward Christine, who sat beside him. Her head would have been leaning against his shoulder were it not for the seatbelt he'd insisted she'd wear. I need to be careful with her, he thought in her delicate condition. Daryl glanced towards her, letting his eyes linger for a moment on her long white dress. He noticed that she was still holding the wedding bouquet, which was already beginning to look the worse for wear. Mrs. Morton, he thought, his bride's new name. He shifted his gaze momentarily to her midsection, which was clearly visible in the crescent moon's pale glow. Her slim belly had yet to betray any sign of the new life that was steadily growing within her. Eyes on the road, darling, Christine said, smiling. Dad will be pretty upset if you flip us over in a ditch before we get home to make our announcement. As he returned his attention to the road that kept unspooling before them, Daryl struggled to return Christine's carefree smile. Soon there could be no hiding the fact that she was carrying his child. But now that they were married, he told himself, there was no longer any need for that. Which news should we break to your dad first? Daryl said with a wry smile. That we're about to make him a grandfather, or that we ran off to a little chapel in Las Vegas to tie the knot before anybody found out? Another quick glance revealed that her smile had been replaced with a thoughtful scowl. Her expression convinced him that she was finally visualizing the same scene that had been plaguing him all weekend, a tableau of the old man reaching for his shotgun while loudly accusing Daryl of getting his innocent daughter pregnant and dragging her off to be further corrupted in the wretched nest of gambling and gangsters that was Las Vegas. The old man certainly would be in no mood to hear Daryl's observation that the Flamingo Hotel had seemed far too nice to be connected with mob types, in spite of what the newspapers had said. A long silence broken only by the rhythmic sounds of tires and the engine engulfed the car. Faded yellow lines paraded out of the darkness only to disappear almost instantly beneath the Olds. After a road sign that read Gallop 50 miles whizzed by, Christine interrupted the quiet. Can you slow down a bit, Daryl? Maybe we shouldn't be in such a hurry to get home. Daryl couldn't have agreed more. As he eased his foot off the pedal, he contemplated blowing right past home. They were young and in love and had each other. They could start a new life together anywhere they wanted. Besides, a trip into the complete unknown had been preferable to dealing with her father when he was at full roar. As the car came to the crest of a low hill, something up ahead caught Daryl's eye. Christine had obviously seen it as well. What's that? She said, her brow furrowing. Daryl studied the distant point of white light in silence. At first, he thought nothing of it. It had to be the headlight of an oncoming vehicle, maybe a motorcycle or a car with a burned-out lamp. Then he noticed it was floating in the air. Maybe it's an airplane, Christine ventured. Maybe, he said, but the speed at which it moved and switched directions was like no aircraft he'd ever seen. He wondered if the government might have been testing some secret project way out in the sparsely populated reaches of western New Mexico. Suddenly, the light began heading quickly towards them, moving like a Japanese Zero preparing to strafe Pearl Harbor. Daryl quickly slowed the Olds down and brought the car to a bumpy halt on the deserted road's shoulder before pulling the wheel all the way to the left. What are you doing? Christine said. Daryl heard an edge of fear in her usually sanguine voice. Daryl did his best to sound calm in the control of the situation. I'm getting us out of here. Shoving the transmission into low gear, Daryl lurched the car into an awkward U-turn, then pushed the accelerator down hard. The car fishtailed onto the blacktop, and as he struggled to get the vehicle back under control. Christine turned around and watched the light approaching through the rear window. The reflection in the rearview mirrors was becoming steadily more bright, rising quickly to almost a blinding intensity. It's still coming towards us, Christine said unnecessarily. Daryl could hear his pulse pounding in his ears, drowning out the strenuous revving of the engine as he slammed the pedal all the way to the floor. He squinted through the gathering brilliance in vain effort to see the road. I'm going to get us killed this way, he thought, suddenly releasing the accelerator. His foot stabbed at the brake, and the Oldsmobile quickly skidded to a halt along the roadside. As the light increased in intensity, flooding the car's interior with golden radiance, a peculiar calm descended onto him. Daryl was mildly surprised to note that he no longer felt any fear. Squinting at Christine, he saw that she too appeared oddly calm. Maybe God's decided that after Hitler and Tojo, there's been enough history. Maybe it's the last days and we're being taken up to heaven. He felt a bittersweet pang of regret for the unborn child that he would now never see. Daryl noticed that Christine had released her seatbelt and opened the passenger side door. Without even taking the time to grab the car keys, Daryl let himself out of the car's other side. Within moments, the couple met at the back of the car, holding hands as they looked into the small, intensifying illumination. Daryl looked up into the source of the ever-spreading light and saw a large and distinct shape hovering within it, growing steadily lower and closer. Gauging the thing's size accurately was next to impossible, though it certainly looked quite large against the starkness of the desert night. He turned his gaze to Christine and stroked her long blonde hair with his free hand. Her smile told him that whatever was coming held no fear for her. Still holding hands, Daryl and Christine Morton took a step toward the fiercely growing light. The light washed over them, swallowing them whole. Today, Chapter 1. Dude, you got him. Steve Case playfully punched his friend in the shoulder, unmindful of the fact that his friend still had his finger on the air rifle's trigger. Monk Pyle grinned, just as careless as he brought up the gun down. His dog, Blue, jumped excitedly until Monk pointed off in the direction of his last shot. Go get it, Blue. As the mutt scampered forward with a growl, Monk wiped his sweat from his brow and scanned the area, alert to any sign of the fleeing jackrabbit's presence. But nothing moved across the expanse of the ochre-hued earth, low cholla, cacti, and coarse desert grasses of the Tin Pipe Bluff. Monk and Steve hadn't really been hunting for any real purpose other than just to enjoy the hunt. It was their mutual day off from Medichem Pharmaceutical, and there wasn't much else interesting or fun to do on a day this hot. They'd already seen the summer blockbusters during the afternoon cheap shows at the Cinema 4 and Del Norte Town Twin Theaters, and neither of them had much on their social calendars at the moment. Graveyard hours at work tended to have a chilling effect on any potential love life. Hey, Blue, you missed him, said Steve, yelling. The dog had run past the downed rabbit and hopped over a scrub-covered hillock near the edge of the woods, his back paws kicking up sandy earth. Steve looked over at Monk, and his face was somewhat expectant. Maybe he smelled something else, bigger game? I hope it's not another coyote, grimaced Monk. Last time he tangled with one of those, it cost me darn near $200 in vet bills. He broke into a languid trot, beckoning for his friend to follow. Come on, let's go see what's got his attention. As the two men climbed the small hill, loose sand and gravel cascading over their scuffed work boots, Monk took a cursory glance at the dead rabbit that lay near the top, smiling for a moment to see that its fur wasn't too badly disfigured by the gunshot. Besides the pelt, the animal's wide, flat feet would be a surefire sale to Skinches, the local taxidermist. Guess those weren't such lucky rabbit's feet after all, he thought as they neared the top. What you got there, Blue? Monk asked. The dog was standing with his back to them, growling and shaking his head back and forth. He was digging frantically into the earth near some trees that had already created a small depression. Monk could see that his pet had already grasped something in its jaws, a dust-covered object that was sticking out of the hole in the ground. A gopher? A moment later, Monk's stomach churned. He realized what Blue had found was no gopher. That's an arm, dude, Steve exclaimed. As they came closer to Blue, Monk could see that the dog was indeed pulling out a human arm, or at least what was left of it. It was barely more than a skeleton at this point, though for some reason the desert animals had left the heat-shriveled, jerky-like flesh alone. Blue wasn't of the same mind, apparently, as he tugged at the appendage, which protruded from the ground at an odd angle. The shredded remains of a brown and white long-sleeve shirt were visible in the dust. What remained of the fabric appeared scorched. Blue, heel, Monk said, his voice commanding. The dog backed off a bit, circled, and then settled into a defensive stance, growling, the hairs along its spine raised and its tail rigid. Monk and Steve crouched, and Monk laid the gun down in the dust. He looked over at his friend. It's definitely human, and it looks like it's attached to something. Steve's eyes were wide. A dead body? Whoa. He reached out as if to touch it, then apparently thought better of it and withdrew his hand. Should we, dig it up? Monk stared at his friend as if he had just arrived from another planet. No, man. This could be like a crime scene or something. We got to call Sheriff Valenti. Something in his mind clinked, and he remembered that his brother, a deputy, had told him that Valenti had been replaced a few months ago. Sheriff Hansen. We'll have to call it in from the CB radio on the truck, Steve said, standing. He looked as if he still wanted to touch the body, but Monk knew he wouldn't. Monk rose as well and grabbed his gun. Slapping his leg to signal Blue to follow, Monk stepped on top of the low hill and prepared to skitter slide down the slope. Grab the rabbit on the way down, he called, gesturing to Steve. Just before moving forward and down, Monk sneaked a final look over his shoulder at the arm, which was still trapped within its dusty grave. From a few yards away, it almost looked like a weird alien planet from some B-grade sci-fi movie. Monk noticed then that the mummified fingers were curled as if they had been grasping at something when their owner had died. Monk shivered, although the air was warm and dry. Whose body is this, and why is it buried out here on the outskirts of Roswell?
Chapter 2. Max Evans stepped through the back door of the Crashdown Cafe into the locker room and prep area. He was always slightly surprised that Jeff Parker didn't keep the door locked, at least during business hours, but maybe he just wasn't inordinately concerned about crime. The crime rate in Roswell wasn't all that high, not the known crime rate anyhow. Max knew that he and his friends had performed more than their share of illegal acts over the last 2 years, though he could justify them given that they generally been committed in the name of self-preservation. Max moved over to the swinging door that led out to the public area of the Crashdown, and he peered through the circular window there. Liz Parker was working, of course, which was his main reason for being there. She was balancing several dirty plates on one arm as she headed back towards the wash area behind the counter. Despite the tired and bored look in her eyes and the wisps of hair that peeked out from under her alien-themed tiara, he couldn't deny her beauty. Even the awful lime green waitress dress with its big-headed silver alien apron didn't make her any less pretty, though he certainly preferred her in a tank top and jeans, her black hair floating freely around her shoulders, accenting her dark almond-shaped eyes. It hadn't even been 2 years since Liz had been shot in the abdomen. Max had only an instant to decide whether he would use his alien powers to heal Liz or preserve his anonymity by letting her die on the cold floor of her family's restaurant. It hadn't been much of a choice. Max had always had a crush on Liz, and even though he and Michael and Isabel had isolated themselves from romantic contact with normal people, and they'd made a pact not to use their alien powers in ways that might bring them unwanted attention, his emotions had been wholly human at that moment. He had put his hand on her wound, concentrated, and allowed his essence to merge with hers for a moment. But that moment had had far-reaching consequences. Max and Isabel and Michael had never allowed anyone to learn that they were really extraterrestrials. And now the number of people who knew the truth of their alien origins, Liz, Maria DeLuca, Alex Whitman, former Sheriff Jim Valenti, his son Kyle, was unnerving. To say nothing of the forces that seemed intent on either exposing or eradicating them. Between the secret military groups first led towards them by the late FBI agent Kathleen Topolsky, plus Nicholas and the alien skins, their less than friendly duplicate counterparts from New York, and assorted others. The last 2 years have been fraught with considerable danger. And then there was Tess, the genetic duplicate of Max's wife on their home world of Antar. Tess's betrayal months ago had been hard on their circle of friends. She had engineered the death of Alex and had manipulated Kyle and others into moving her plan forward. And then when her treachery stood revealed, Tess had stolen the granolith, the craft that would allow her to return to their home planet, carrying within her Max's child, the unborn son of their world's king and the heir to the throne of Antar. Things hadn't been the same since Tess's departure. Max's future with Liz remained uncertain, though he knew that although Liz still seemed to have feelings for him, the memory of his tryst with Tess wore heavily on her. He tried not to dwell on the matter of Tess too much, but his heart ached for the son he would never see. He was determined to find a way to reach home again and to see his son. Almost as if she knew he was there, Liz looked towards the doorway's window and Max. He raised a hand in a sheepish wave, slightly embarrassed at having been caught staring at her. She smiled slightly, then dipped her head away. She spoke to one of the other waitresses behind the counter and headed back in Max's direction. "Hi, Max," she said simply after she'd come through the door. Max wanted to take her in his arms, kiss her, smooth the unruly shock of hair from her brow. He settled and said, forgiving her a wan smile, swallowing his more intense emotions. "Hey, I just came by to see how things were going. We had a rush earlier, but it's kind of slowed down. What about you? Aren't you working at the UFO Center today?" Brody had to do something with his daughter this morning, so he decided not to open. He said he might come in later, but gave me the day off if I wanted it. Max shifted his feet and regarded Liz from beneath his dark bangs. "I was hoping you might, be able to take some time off and we could hang out or something. Maybe go to a movie or..." "Oh," Liz said simply. He could see her eyes jagging back and forth, the sign she was considering 15 complex answers at once. It was those times when she usually was reduced to one-syllable responses. "Well, sure. Not now, but later. I'm off at 6 or so." She turned and looked at a schedule posted on the wall, then turned back nodding. "Yeah, 6 it is, and my schedule just happens to be free." He grinned widely. "Great. Anything you want to..." The door to the dining area opened with an abrupt slam and a harried-looking Maria DeLuca launched into the room. She was dressed in the same ridiculous waitress outfit as Liz. Liz, do you know where? She saw Liz wasn't alone and gave Max a cursory glance. Oh, hi, Max. Before he could respond, she turned back to her friend. Liz, do you know where Michael is? Billy's shift at the grill ended 15 minutes ago and he's getting really whiny. Did you call him? Liz asked. Maria rolled her eyes. Duh, of course, I called him. But he's probably ignoring my calls. We had a thing last night that she stopped herself, looked at Max, and then waved her hands as if to wipe the air clean. Anyhow, he's not answering. I haven't heard from him, Liz said. I'll see if I can find him, Max said. He looked longingly at Liz for a moment. Staying with her was preferable by far to managing whatever new trouble Michael may have gotten himself into. Oh, that would be great, Maria said with sarcastic enthusiasm. Not that I want to interpret your fumbling stabs at rekindling your epic but tragic romance, but we've got a business to run here. Liz shot Maria a dirty look. Maria put her hand on Liz's arm as she headed them both back towards the door. Sorry, Liz, I'm just cranky. She turned back and looked at Max for a moment. Why can't you guys have some kind of useful alien communicators implanted in your pecs or something? Not waiting for his answer, she went back through the swinging door. Liz shook her head mortified. Max stepped towards her. I'll just go look for Michael then. She looked up at him, but he badly wanted to embrace her again. He decided instead to leap in another direction. He bent slightly and kissed her forehead. See you tonight. As he turned to leave, Max saw a smile light up Liz's face, but knew it couldn't outshine the one that was forming on his own. Max wasn't surprised when he received no response to his knock. He knew that silence didn't necessarily mean that the apartment was empty. Michael was more than capable of ignoring even an urgent knock at his door, particularly when he was in one of his bleaker emotional funks. Max placed a hand on the doorknob without turning it. Concentrating for all of a second, he sent a surge of power through his hand and into the knob. He turned in his grasp as though exercising a will of its own. Michael Guerin was seated on the couch, his back to the door, papers spread out across a coffee table. You don't need to use your powers, Max, he said without looking. It wasn't locked. Michael, what's going on? You're late for your shift at the Crashdown. Max moved towards the couch to see what Michael was studying so intently. So they sent the king after me to get me to my job flipping burgers, Michael asked. Max knew that Michael was still having trouble dealing with the recent revelations about their past lives on Antar. Max had been king and Michael had been his second in command and military advisor. But while the arrangement may have worked well on their homeworld, it was often less than ideal here on Earth. Here they were different people, literally. Michael turned and Max saw he was holding an old photograph and some musty papers. A padded mailing envelope lay on the couch beside him. Laurie Dupree just sent me this scrapbook. She found it in the mansion with her grandfather's stuff. Max recognised the man in the picture as Charles Dupree. The yellowed photograph had been made in 1935, but it may as well have been a shot of Michael taken yesterday. Earlier in the year, they had discovered that Dupree was quite likely the genetic template for the human DNA that Michael carried. What is it? Max asked momentarily, putting aside the situation at the Crashdown. More notes from Laurie's grandfather about his abduction by aliens in 1947. A whole series of abductions, actually. These weren't in the diaries I got from her before, Michael said, gesturing towards a set of slim volumes sitting on the table amid the papers. She said these were hidden. Max's brow furrowed as he concentrated for a moment. 1947. That's the same year our ship crashed. You got it, Michael said. These notes were written about 6 months before the crash, and given what he writes about, I'm betting it was during one of those abductions that the samples of his DNA were taken and used to make me. Max sat down in a nearby chair, his mouth falling open involuntarily. He reached for the papers and Michael handed them to him. He knew they got his DNA somehow, and that it had to be either Nasado or the other alien who actually took the sample, or it could have been others on the ship who didn't survive. Whoever, Michael said with a shrug, but it wasn't only Dupree's DNA they took. He wrote about seeing others aboard the alien ship, including a little girl and a young newlywed couple. That means that, Michael gestured towards Max, the other templates. Max stared at Michael with his wonder. Max's genetic human makeup, as well as that of Isabel and Tess, had been taken from other humans, just as Michael's had, but they'd found no clue as to the identities of their human donors. We always knew they were out there, Max said at length, but we've never had any hard information about them before. Does Dupree say anything specific? No names in this section, just descriptions, Michael said, frowning at the stacks on the table. There are other pages with lots of names on them, and he may have written more pages that are missing from this pile of stuff. It's hard to tell. They're all written like he was on drugs or something. It's not a very easy read. If we can find out who the other 3 templates are, we might find answers to a whole lot of other questions, Max said, his eyes wide. Right, Michael said dismissively. Or we can have an alien and abductee family reunion. Max gave him a sour look. Let me have a turn going through the stuff. Maybe I can find some information at the UFO Center. If I can get some clues from this as to where to look, or even what it is I'm looking for. Meanwhile, you better go to work or Maria's going to... Max's cell phone rang, interrupting him. Max clicked it on. Hello? A shrill voice buzzed into his ear. Yeah, Maria, he was here, but he's already left. He should be there any minute. Another burst of voice, and Max winced slightly. You tell him that. You'll see him before I will. Yeah, okay, bye. Max looked over at Michael, who was standing up and pulling on a loose-fitting plaid shirt over his t-shirt. As I was about to say, Maria's pretty pissed off. I'm shocked, Maxwell, Michael said. I'll look into some more, Max said, holding up a few of Dupree's notes. Don't take the stuff with you, Michael replied as he stepped towards the door. I don't want them to accidentally get mixed up with Brody's files or something. Max nodded, and a moment later, Michael was gone. Max settled back in the chair and began reading. The page on top appeared to have been written in a shakier hand than the rest, as if Dupree was extremely agitated when he wrote it. As Max read further, he started to understand why. Max had found what appeared to be Dupree's written account of his abduction by the aliens.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. We are now on to chapter 3. Sunday, January 19th, 1947. The world around him is awash in searing white light. Squinting against the glare, Charles Dupree slowly drifted back to consciousness, colored spots capering across his vision. Lying on his back, he felt disorientated, dazzled, and stunned by the merciless brilliance. His first thought was to wonder whether he was dead, but as he gradually became aware of his body, he dismissed the notion. Ghosts don't have bladders, he thought, and I have to piss like a racehorse. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the glare, Dupree struggled to turn his head. The air carried a faint but odd aroma, like hot maple syrup mixed with Tabasco sauce. He was determined to take in more of the room in order to find out where he was. His movements were sluggish, labored. It felt as though he were fighting some invisible force that had gained control of his body, forcing him into immobility. They must have drugged me, he thought. Anger and fear jostling at the forefront of his muddled thoughts. He paused in his struggles for a moment. Who exactly were they, and how had they taken him from the lonely stretch of Route 10 he'd been traversing on his way back to Tucson? He remembered the dark ribbon of roadway that had stretched ahead of him into the desert night. He recalled the hypnotic rhythm of the painted lines as they suddenly appeared beneath his headlight beams and just as quickly disappeared beneath the truck. Then came the dazzling, searing light. Dupree remembered being startled into a swerve that had gotten oil rusty up on two wheels for a terrifying, time-frozen instant. He'd come very close to rolling the truck right over before the wheels finally regained contact with the pavement, sending him into a screeching spin. Just as he'd manhandled the vehicle back under control, it mysteriously lost power. The dead truck rolled to a stop on the shoulder, gravel crunching and popping beneath its tires. Dupree had felt vulnerable inside the stopped truck. It was like the time he'd been trapped behind enemy lines with nothing but a bayonet knife, a 9mm pistol, and 2 bullets, only the situation was even worse. At least during the war, he'd known what he was up against. Here on the roadside, bathed in a mysterious light, he had no idea who or what was after him. Hiding in the all-consuming glare hadn't seemed like a viable option. Stepping cautiously outside the truck appeared to be his best alternative, whatever the danger. He stood on the gravel-strewn shoulder, an arm thrown up across his face to protect his eyes from the brilliance. Squinting over his forearm, he saw that the light was coming from the sky, and that it seemed to be growing steadily more intense. Seconds later, it engulfed him entirely. And then he had found himself here, wherever here was. Now that his eyes had adjusted to the ambient light in the chamber in which he had just awakened, Dupree looked straight up, then shifted his gaze to look left. He saw that he was in a metal-walled room with a high vaulted ceiling. It was hard to tell precisely where the light was coming from. All he could tell for certain was that this place was like nothing he had seen in all his 27 years. In fact, it was hard to believe it was even real. Great, Dupree thought. I've been hijacked into the cover of a cheap pulp magazine. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He forced his head to follow it, though it felt like so much lead. A night dark silhouette blocked some of the room's light, like a pinhole projection of a solar eclipse. A vaguely human form, visible only as a moving shadow, glided toward him, followed by a second figure. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt too thick and heavy to form words. The shadow shapes approached him closely, and he felt a sudden bump, as though the surfaces on which he lay was being moved. They're wheeling me away somewhere, he thought, wishing he could speak, or at least get a good glimpse of whoever was moving him across the chamber. Panic warred with hope within him. Maybe I'm safe. Maybe somebody found me on the side of the road. Maybe this is a hospital. But if this place really was a hospital, then why was it that he could hear no one speaking? The only sounds that reached his ears were the gentle whispers of wheels moving across a smooth floor, the small footfalls on either side of him, and an intermittent clicking noise, like cicadas serenading one another on a hot summer night. The weird quasi-silence stretched as Dupree was wheeled into an adjacent chamber. Still more light, this time from gleaming ceiling-mounted fixtures, assaulted his eyes, forcing him to shut them tightly. Fear and a nearly irresistible desire to flee rose within him as countless small hands bore him from where he lay onto a second hard surface. He wanted to rise, leap to his feet, lash out, run like hell, but his body wouldn't respond, and still no one spoke. Dupree tried to get a good look at the room, but now even as his eyes refused to respond to his will, hands moved across his flesh. He felt a sharp jab in his left forearm, then another in his right. An abrupt pain seized his abdomen, then just as swiftly abated. It felt as though something sharp had skewered his right thigh, causing the muscles to cramp and spasm. Something warm touched his temple, gently at first, only to be replaced by a metallic object that felt like a knitting needle heated neatly to its melting point. The object made a sickening rasp as it suddenly moved, instantly piercing skin and bone. Dupree's mouth opened, his lips formed a scream, but he heard nothing save the busy footfalls of his tormentors, the methodical clatter of their instruments, and those maddening rhythmic clicking sounds which began to sound almost like a language he couldn't understand. Were these people communicating in some sort of code? The pain subsided slightly, and Dupree found that he could no longer open his eyes again. Spots no longer danced before him, and the light levels now seemed almost tolerable. He saw that his body had been strapped to a low table and that his shirt and dungarees were shredded. Long, slender metallic objects pierced his body in numerous places, along his torso, his legs, his arms. A forest of delicate, silvery needles surrounded his head. Through the tangle of weird apparatuses, Dupree watched his captors move. They no longer appeared only as backlit silhouettes, though the metal objects that now surrounded his head made it hard to get a good look at them as they passed before him, going about their obscure business, because each of them seemed indistinguishable from the others, and because they moved in and out of his view so quickly, he wasn't certain how many of them were present. There might have been 4 or 5 of them, or perhaps 3 times that many, judging from the repetitive clicking sounds he heard coming from points all around the room. He watched the creatures as closely as his almost immovable head allowed, though he could see only their backs as they turned their attention to other parts of the room, clicking who only knew what information back and forth to one another. Whoever these people were, there was no way they could be doctors. Doctors generally didn't make cricket noises, and doctors usually wore white coats or surgical gowns. But these people seemed to be naked, their wrinkled skin a mottled gray. They were hairless, with heads that seemed too large for their truncated bodies, and long-fingered limbs that looked weirdly slender and overtly flexible. At least one of them, he suddenly noticed with a shiver, seemed to be covered from head to toe with a thick coating of a blue gelatinous goo. His stomach threatened to turn over violently. He closed his eyes tightly until the waves of discomfort passed. Sideshow freaks, Dupree thought, though he never seen their like at any carnival midway. He wanted to scream at them, but discovered that he couldn't make a sound. He heard silence, broken only by a few desultory clicks in the quiet clatter of unimaginable metal instruments. The sounds brought to mind the horrific torture some of his buddies had suffered at the hands of their Japanese captors during the war. With an effort that brought a sweat to his brow, Dupree turned his head to the right. He was startled to see that there was indeed other people in the chamber who were recognizably human. He felt a surge of relief, though it lasted only long enough for him to notice that his newfound companions were in no position to help him. On a low table only a dozen or so feet away from his own lay a young man and a woman, both unconscious and breathing shallowly. They appeared to be in their early or middle 20s, not much younger than he was. The woman was strikingly beautiful, with long blonde hair and a physique that might have elicited a wolf whistle from him under happier circumstances. She was dressed in a long white wedding gown, a bouquet of flowers still clutched in her hands, an incongruous sight in this unfriendly place. She looked as though she might be roused by a kiss, like some fairy tale princess. The man who lay strapped beside her wore a disheveled black tuxedo, his dark hair tousled across his forehead, revealing his protuberant ears. A look of determination was frozen across his features, as though his captors hadn't succeeded in taking him without a fight. Like Dupree, both the bride and groom were festooned with innumerable metal contraptions, needles, and probes of various lengths and sizes. A pair of the gray-backed figures busied themselves checking the ungodly equipment that pierced the couple's bodies in countless places. He tried to shout at them to leave the couple alone, his fists clenched and unclenched in impotent rage. He wanted nothing more than to get his hands around one of their gray mottled necks. From the left side of the room, a child's voice cut through the silence like the peal of a small bell. With another exhausting effort, Dupree turned his head in the direction of the sound. Two other short gray creatures were shepherding a little girl into the room, ushering her towards another low table. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old, wore a yellow gingham dress and displayed a beguiling smile. She was a remarkably beautiful child, with blonde hair falling around her shoulders in a long, fine cascade. Her hands and knees were grass-stained, as though she'd just been romping in the yard. The little girl was giggling. She thinks they're playing, he thought. Horror left a metallic taste in his mouth. Dupree's fear quickly gave way to anger. If these freaks thought he was just going to sit idly while they hurt a helpless child, then they had another thing coming. Whatever drugs they pump me with have to wear off sooner or later. There's got to be a way off this table. He noted with no small amount of satisfaction that he seemed to have recovered some control of his body over the past minute or so. Unfortunately, the numerous metal probes piercing his flesh were keeping him effectively pinned to the table. He felt like a butterfly trapped in some demonic bug collector's killing jar. Dupree watched helplessly as one of the small gray people used its 2 long arms to hoist the laughing little girl upward. The creature set her down on the table with surprising gentleness. Another began strapping her to the table. The child's eyes still held no fear. "Big eyes," she exclaimed, and he noticed that their captor's dark eyes were indeed quite large. Those eyes never blinked, adding to their eeriness. They must be wearing masks, Dupree thought. He turned his eyes to the ceiling, which bristled with gleaming metal armatures, identical to the ones that held him and the newlywed couple. Slowly, the armatures lowered a dozen sharp metal lances towards the laughing child. The gray creatures, their faces obscured by the instruments that surrounded Dupree's head, clicked to one another in apparent approval. "No, I have to distract those damn carnies." Dupree opened his mouth and tried to shout a warning to the little girl. He heard a loud but inarticulate cry and was mildly surprised when he realized that the tortured sounds had come from his own throat. Dupree tried to shout again, this time with somewhat better control over both lungs and voice. "Get away from her, you bastards! I'll show you where you can stick those needles." The echo of his cry lingered for a moment. The clicking abruptly stopped. The little girl ceased her laughter, her eyes as big as saucers. One of the gray figures turned towards him. Dupree was exhausted from the effort of shouting and felt as if his body were melting onto the table like cheese on a hot griddle. But he was encouraged by the fact that he had finally gotten the attention of these people. He closed his eyes, screwing up his courage. "Maybe I can convince them to release us. Or at least talk them into letting the little girl go. I just have to reach them on some human level." Then Dupree opened his eyes and found himself looking directly into the face of one of the small gray men. With only inches separating them, Charles Dupree stared deeply into Plumside's eyes, black as an anthracite mine at midnight. And it was no mask, he realized. The face that regarded him was anything but human. That's chapter 3.